Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. It's good to be back after a couple of weeks break for the holidays. Glad to see everybody back here. We are continuing in chapter 34. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So we'll just jump right into the text here and just kind of break it down as we go. So it starts off with the phrase, the great Tao. And what's interesting, if we see this in Chinese, it's actually da Dao, which I always find is kind of a funny phrase. But it is a phrase that is not unique to Taoism or the Daodejing in particular. It seems to maybe be originating prior to that. And it has an interesting connotation that I want to bring up a quote here from one of the scholars that was talking about this. He says, Xin Dao, that's a person, used the notion of great Tao to refer to the actual history of everything, past to future. Thus, he drew the conclusion that we simply will follow the great Tao and that it makes neither conceptual nor normative judgments. That's Chad Hansen, if anybody's following that. So what's interesting here is we've got this idea of past to future as history. So we've talked frequently in the past about the possibility of something like determinism, that if everything is essentially following the laws of physics, then you could potentially understand what was going to happen next by simply knowing the state of the universe plus the laws of physics. And you could then run that forward and backwards to kind of understand the whole scope of things. Of course, we don't have the capability to have that level of information. So there's no feasible way to practically do that. We can do it partially with things like forecasting weather and things along those lines. But as we know with weather, small variations in understanding lead to big changes. So we can't actually project out very far. But conceptually, that's the idea. And what's fascinating is we have this idea already here in classical China. Xin Dao was, or sometimes Xinzi, was one of the philosophers of that same period, of the Warring States period, already having kind of a similar idea around this, kind of more of a deterministic worldview, which is fascinating. And within that, then he's also got the idea that there isn't this idea of judgments or anything that you could call like normative in terms of how we would do valuations. It's just simply adhering to those patterns. So we're going to come back to this towards the end and dive into it a little bit further. But just keep in mind, initially, when they're talking about the great Tao, this is the context behind that, that there's this vast history that goes into the future that we are participating in, but there's the question about, can we actually make any difference with that? It's actually going to just unfold the way it's going to unfold is kind of the idea. So continuing on, then we're going to see some different attributes about the Tao. And we want to remember that this document is being written to address potential leaders of the day. During the Warring States period, of course, China is in a great deal of chaos, and there's a lot of different feudal lords that are trying to rise to dominance. And there's a lot of these new philosophies that are popping up, and each of them are trying to provide guidance to potential rulers as well as individuals about how they should pattern their lives. And again, Tao is what is meant by this idea of path or way. And so there's a lot of Taos on offer. Daodejing was simply one of many. And it's going to go through how it understands this concept of Tao and the relevance it would have for potential rulers as well as for individuals. So from the beginning, we've seen that Tao, in terms of the Tao Te Ching, was not something that was an optional way that you could follow. It was something that was more akin to like the laws of nature. something like gravity, where it doesn't matter if you're aware of it or not, you're going to end up following it. It's a matter of how much we recognize those patterns that make up what we understand as the Tao. And moving in harmony with that, we can be more successful in what we do, versus if we try to fight against it, we're not going to ultimately be successful and probably bring suffering on ourselves and others. So it's important then, as they're going through this book, to look at the different attributes of what that Tao is. So that's where we're going to go next. So this, excuse me, it says the great Tao flows unobstructed in every direction. And this literally is the idea of left and right. So we've got an idea that there's nowhere that it doesn't go, but also that it is incorporating both sides of the extremes, that it's transforming from one to the other. It's this idea of the yin yang, that everything is kind of this balance between these two different types of opposites, and it's kind of flowing in both directions, and it's incorporating both of those. It doesn't favor one over the other. There's just different times when one comes into play and the other comes more into play. So let me back up for that just a second too. The thing we want to think about here in terms of these attributes then is that if there's an emulation that's supposed to be happening in terms of at a personal or at a ruler level, this is definitely bringing in the idea of flexibility. And we see this a lot within the Daodejing when it talks about like a new plant, that it's flexible so it can survive the storm, whereas something that's old or dead wood is going to be brittle and it's going to break. One of the lines that's coming up that I like a lot says that the disciples of life are, I think it says, soft and green, something along those lines, and that the disciples of death are hard and solid. So there's definitely this idea that they're saying that this flexibility, this ability to be able to adjust and to move given on the circumstances, is going to be important for how we conduct ourselves or how we rule. And that someone who is rigid and fixed in their position is going to find themselves in some trouble. Then goes on to say, all things rely on it to conceive and be born, and it does not deny even the smallest creation. So one of the concepts that we've looked at is this idea of absence and presence, that there's within the Taoist or classical Taoist framework here, there is no nothing, that what appears to be nothing is actually something. It's just at a point where we're not able to perceive it. And out of that, everything that exists, which it refers to as the 10,000 things, emerge. We can kind of think of this as different configurations of whatever that absence is, in such a way that we're actually able to interact with it. But at some point, all those 10,000 things end up going back into absence. So there's a movement from absence back to, from absence to presence, and then back to absence again. So this would be where they're talking about those patterns of how things seem to come into existence and how they go back out. Everything is dependent on those patterns. It's how things are conceived and born. It's also how they go back. But what's interesting here is it's making the claim that there's no judgment, again, about any of the 10,000 things. Even the smallest thing is not denied or rejected. So one of the core components in terms of an attribute that's being brought up here is the idea of radical acceptance, that everything is accepted, not in the sense that from a human perspective, there isn't anything that we would actually do or any types of goals that we would have that we're trying to achieve, but in the sense that everything can be understood a little bit more neutrally. So if we think about like that story of the farmer with the horse, where his horse runs away and the crowd comes and says, "Oh, how unfortunate." And the farmer just simply responds, "We'll see." The horse comes back with a bunch of friends. other horses, and everybody in the village again says, "Wow, how fortunate." And the farmer says, "Well, we'll see." And then his son's trying to break in one of the horses and falls off, breaks his leg, and everybody's like, "How unfortunate." And again, he just says, "We'll see." Army comes through conscripting all the young men. His son is exempt because of his broken leg. Everybody's like, again, how fortunate. So we see this idea of this value judgment just keeps flip-flopping back and forth based on this perspective. And the farmer, the wise man, is just recognizing that, what is the reality of this? We don't know. We have to kind of wait and see how everything unfolds. It could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. And again, how do we even decide what is a good thing or a bad thing? But what we want to note is that the farmer's not doing anything. He's got a farm. He's farming. He's got a fence that probably needs to be put into repair. When the horses come back, he's actively working to try and break them in so that they can be useful in whatever's happening at the farm. So it's not that Taoism is promoting a do nothing type of an approach, or that there isn't any types of goals or values. The idea is that those goals and values need to be recognized as subjective, not objective. So there's a strong challenge to some of the ideas of morality here, but also the idea that we want to bring those actions, those goals into alignment with the Tao or the nature of reality so that we can work with it as opposed to against it. So that's where this idea of acceptance is coming in. Not that it just means that everything happens and we just sit back and don't do anything, but that we are withholding judgment in terms of trying to make it a good or a bad thing. Because in the end, that doesn't actually help. It's not objective, and it ultimately can cause a great deal of suffering. If we are actively rejecting things that we don't actually have any control over, that doesn't help us, right? It's only when we learn to be more accepting of that process that we're able to then have a clearer perspective on how we want to actually engage in what's happening. So this would be the idea of that more radical kind of acceptance. And it says here, even of the smallest of creation. And I'm going to pause after this to kind of get some feedback, but there's a fair amount of material we need to get through. So I'm just going to kind of go through the first part of this a little bit quickly, but we will have time to kind of discuss this. Continues and says, when it has accomplished great wonders, it does not claim them for itself. So here, if we think about the 10,000 things and we think about the cosmos and even just magnificent things here on this planet and just the mystery of life and everything that goes with that, there's this idea, not that the Tao is personified, but if it was personified, it's saying it doesn't even take credit for anything. And so there's this idea of humility that we can understand, that there's not this idea of taking credit, which is a common theme we see. When we're thinking then from the ruler perspective, there's going to be ways in which the ruler is going to be able to orchestrate things in order for things to happen. But ultimately, it's all the different moving parts, all the people, the environment that actually allow for that to happen. And so the ruler is not actually going to take credit for it. As individuals, we are never solely responsible for anything. We're always engaging either with things from our past or in the present that are in collaboration with everything that happens. And so there's this recognition that we're not in this alone, that we are part of a larger picture that we always want to recognize. And so there's definitely a resistance to something like pride or taking credit for things. It continues saying, it nourishes infinite worlds, yet it does not seek to master the smallest creature. So again, here we have this idea of control. There isn't this controlling aspect when we're thinking about the Tao. It's something that is more spontaneously followed or naturally followed, as opposed to someone trying to seek control and trying to coerce obedience. So this would be, again, kind of a contrast with the way that rulership can happen, where it's trying to figure out ways to dominate versus ways to entice or to invite into cooperation. And the same kind of thing can happen at the individual level. We can either be involved in trying to coerce those around us, or we can find ways to work with them. Then it says, since it was without wants and desires, it can be considered humble, or the word here is small. And this is going to be again in contrast to the normal expectations of something like rulership, where things are expected to be great and profound and worshipful and, large and grand. And here it's identifying Tao, as it says in so many other places, is so small you can't even see it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, but yet it pervades everything. So even in that smallness, which could seem very humble and unpretentious, it somehow is engaged with everything. This would again be kind of that contrast for emulation about how do we get involved with this idea of rulership, or how do we engage with others. It needs to be in a way that we're approaching it very humbly. Then all creation seeks it for refuge, yet it does not seek to master or control. We've kind of talked about this previously, but this is kind of reiterated. This idea for seeks for refuge is actually talking about this idea of return. So when we talked about absence and presence, it's also talked about returning to the source when it goes back to absence. And that's kind of the idea here, is everything goes back to it. And then it concludes, because it does not seek greatness, it is able to accomplish truly great things. So, number of kind of contrasts there that are brought up in terms of how we might emulate them. And I've just kind of collected them together into some contrasts that we can kind of go over. And I'll see if you had some thoughts about this idea of flexible and inflexible as it applies to something like either management or rulership, or how we think about our relationships with one another, or situations that arise in life. What are your thoughts on how it's presenting these contrasts?
I think for me, not just at work, but with people in general, the more flexible you are in trying to at least understand their point of view and not just immediately shut them down and be flexible and say things like, well, if you don't agree with me or if you don't share my thoughts, then I'm closing you out. But if you just at least seek to understand them, even if you don't agree with them, you have a much better chance of having a connection with them still. Like with family especially, that can be hard to keep the connections and also like understand that they have different beliefs than you. And I think being flexible can help with that, even though it's very difficult.
Yeah. What is the appeal to being inflexible?
It's easier.
In which way?
And that if they don't, well, in my example, if they don't agree with you and you don't want to put in the work of being flexible, then you can just say, oh, you don't agree with me. Okay, like, see you later. And sometimes that is necessary, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah. We definitely could see something where situations are more destructive, relationships that maybe we need to be separated from. But in
Yeah,
general,
I've experienced both, and I think like I always try to be flexible first.
mhm,
I think that's a head of the nail there, Taylor. Like there is a point where we can try to be open-minded, but at some point it's a waste of your energy and your own effort into something that's not immovable on their side. Like you
If
can
they're not
argue all you
willing to
want
be
with strangers on the
flexible.
internet, but at the end of the day, you have to protect your own mental health. And if you're coming across a person who's definitely from the opposing side of the argument, and they're not coming in to argue with in a good faith to learn and discuss, but they're there just to emulate their own truth, um, or repeat and just claim their own facts, alternative facts, as our premier said not too long ago. Um, then there's no reason for you to be flexible. There's no reason for you to be open-minded, and there is a benefit of standing true for what you believe and standing for your own principles rather than trying to please everybody.
Yeah, if they're just there to stick a flag in the sand, then it's not really worth it.
And
So,
Taylor, I will say, cutting
Jim,
up to family. Sorry, cutting out family ties can be difficult, but it's worth it.
Yeah. And there.
Dane?
Jim, this idea of flexible versus inflexible, I think of a lot in terms of goals versus strategies. And the analogy with water is helpful because, for example, if water is flowing downhill and there's something in the way, water is flexible to flow around it, but it's not going to flow uphill. It's still going down. And in the sense, I think of this type of flexibility, like if you have a particular outcome in mind, then if that outcome is not fixed, then you're like a coconut drifting on the ocean. You're not going anywhere. But if you have an outcome or an intention in mind, but you're flexible in how you go about achieving it, you're flexible in your strategies, your tactics, etc. It's kind of like the difference between a coconut that's just floating on the ocean adrift, subject to the random forces of currents and tides and wind and whatnot, versus a sailing ship that's also adrift on the ocean, subject to all the random forces, but has a fixed intention and is able to sail from point A to point B on the map by changing its internal configuration, flexibly taking advantage of the changes in external forces to actually maintain a fixed outcome or direction.
Yeah, and I think this is a key point of yin yang, is that there's both things are needed, right? There's a time to be open to how things unfold and a time to be more directive in what you're trying to accomplish. And so there's that kind of flexibility. An interesting point, I think, too, that Taylor brought up about it being easier to not be flexible is an interesting one to think about too, because if it appears that there's a lot of effort that's involved in terms of trying to be flexible, or how do we be accommodating, or how do we work with differences from our own perspective, then it can feel like, well, I'm just not going to worry about that. And if they don't stay my friends, if we don't stay family, then whatever. But then we find ourselves in a different situation where maybe some of our connections are now different. This, I think, is one of the biggest challenges with our modern world, is that we have created a situation in which relationships are optional. If we go back to the situation of, let's say, pre-agriculture, and definitely after that as well, but for sure beforehand, we were utterly dependent on being a part of a community. To be cut out or to lose those connections was literally life and death. And so there was a lot of work that had to go into how do we maintain appropriate social relationships. And in our modern situation, we're still all dependent on each other, but we do it through more of an anonymous process. Excuse me. How a lot of the things work through the way we do government and the way we've set up society is it allows us to not have to be, in a sense, kind of responsible for our relationships, of being able to be good. What's the word? How would you say if somebody's good at relationships? Relationshipper? I don't know what it is. But,
Yeah.
that craft, that skill of how do we maintain healthy relationships is allowed to kind of just go away because in so many respects it feels like we don't need it, and we've ended up with a world where there's unbelievable amounts of loneliness and isolation in a way that's probably never happened before in world history, and it's having pretty profound psychological impacts. So it's a particular risk we have right now that we can conceive of relationships as optional. And I don't want to downplay what was brought up in terms of really destructive relationships and how those have to be dealt with. I'm not trying to say that we need to stay in destructive relationships. But I think sometimes what counts for destructive relationships it can be overplayed. It's simply that they don't agree with me, and that's not necessarily the same thing. So this is an interesting thing then in thinking about the nature of nature, how everything is connected and interdependent, and those relationships matter, and where something like that flexibility can come into play. And this might be a particular challenge for us where relationships are much more optional now. And that kind of gets into this idea of that radical acceptance versus conditional. So in those relationships, we can say, I'll be friends with you as long as you play by these rules. Or we can be a little bit more open to differences. Again, I don't want to get this into the question about the destructive part, but just more generally, this is a pretty big difference for us as well. What are your thoughts on this idea of radical acceptance?
To Taylor's point earlier, we are conditioned or kind of forced societally by accepting our family, or into the radical acceptance. I mean, it's a family, you have to love them and everything, and it's hard for us to put the conditions on it. I'm going to accept you only if you're going to be kind to me, if you're not going to be toxic and problematic for my relationships with you. And on the other side, it's also very easy for us to be conditional in terms of our comfort, as Taylor said. You're smart today, Taylor. I really love that. You have if you can put a barriers or arbitrary conditions for accepting others just because you don't understand, just because you don't want to change, just because you don't want you don't make it easy on yourself. Conditional acceptance can be kind of a barrier for us to keep others out of our lives. And I really frequently see that when it comes to people who are houseless, who do not have the privilege of living somewhere safe, or people who are victims of addiction, and because we don't understand it, because we believe we have some preconceived notions about their reason, about their state, or what and how do they get to their state. We tend to put the conditions on it. Well, I'm gonna accept you only if you are clean, or if you are, if you have a house, if you are treating me differently. So there's some different variations in terms of what is easy for us and what should be easy for us. I think on both sides, it's a challenge for all of us to challenge our own what should be or what can be the radical acceptance, what we should do in terms of don't be forced to accept your family, toxic family members as having to be in there, but at the same time force yourself to accept others without the need to understand the situation, because they are still human beings. They deserve compassion and kindness.
What do you think, Martin, is happening when somebody comes across someone who's homeless, who maybe is disheveled or doesn't smell so great? What's happening, do you think, in somebody's mind that makes it difficult for them to be open to them as a fellow human being?
I would think of two things separately. One is definitely going to be perceived a threat and risk based on preconceived notions in terms of, dirty people are dangerous. And also, I think the secondary, so that being in terms of your personal safety. At some point, you do need to protect yourself from whatever is coming at you. But if you perceive some, false risk ahead of you, that's a different story than actually seeing being attacked. That's a two different things. And the second piece in my mind is just the environmental, as we talked about, the carved wood, and how we were carved in terms of understanding what people with addiction or people who are houseless, how did they get there? And it takes a lot of challenging your own notions to understand, say, you know what, they didn't choose to be houseless, they didn't choose to be drug addicted, they didn't choose to be in a situation where they are a result of their environments just as much as their decisions. So I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of the community and misinformation about the community that others are our environments perpetuate and form our own opinions. So I think there's two different things: the perceived risk and our preconceived notions.
How
Yeah.
about this one? How about the thought, if I interact with this one, I'll have to interact with all of them?
Mm. Yeah, so there's definitely, I've got limited resources, whether it's energy or food or shelter, and I can't take care of everybody. I got to think of myself. Yeah, that could definitely be a thing. And I wanted to kind of go back on a couple of things Martin brought up as well. So when we think about the safety concern, this is where a lot of the cultural things come into play, that when we see people who are going by the cultural norms, we have a higher sense of confidence that they are adhering to the rest of the cultural norms, which is it's not appropriate to just hit somebody for no reason and so forth. When we see somebody outside of those cultural norms, it creates a little bit more of an anxiety because we don't know what else they don't know. If they're not staying clean, if they're not staying with a job, if they're not living in a house, are they, what else don't they do, right? So that's where a lot of that anxiety can spring from, is that failure for people to kind of conform to to the cultural norms that we exist within. And then the other thing that's interesting, you talked about how we have to kind of readjust our assessment of them in terms of being able to have some compassion, but you didn't really talk about readjust our assessment from what. And so tell me if I'm speaking incorrectly, but I'm assuming that you would say that a lot of the incorrect assumptions that typically would happen is that somebody's judging them as that they're just being lazy, or they're just looking for handouts, or they are drug users or whatever, something along those lines. Is that kind of what you had in mind?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those all become really interesting factors in terms of, what is my place in this, kind of going back to Dane, do we have, what can I actually do about this situation, if anything? There's the concern about difference and what does that mean in terms of safety. And there's the concern about the judgment. And this is an interesting place where the concept of Da Tao, the great Tao, this idea that there is this kind of played out history, ties back into more modern concepts of this idea of determinism. So you brought up, Martin, about the other factors that come into play. These could be biological in terms of genetic, it could be in terms of environmental, how they were raised or not raised, what kind of, things did they receive in terms of education? Are they involved with drugs? How did they get there? All these kind of things that come into play that need to be taken into consideration. We can't just shrink everything down to, oh, this person just made bad decisions. It's not to say that decisions weren't made, but they weren't made in isolation. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that kind of goes along with that. And the more we can be aware of that larger context, the easier it is to have compassion for others and ourselves, actually, because we can start to see, that we are not, no one is solely responsible for themselves. We operate in a society that likes to operate under that illusion, but there's lots of ways we could get into looking at how that's not actually the case. We'll kind of touch on that a bit more here in a moment. But those are some good thoughts here, and how we can start to think about the distinction between this idea of acceptance and conditional. Again, going back to the farmer and how he's not making that judgment call, being open to seeing how things are unfolding and so forth. So then we have humility and pride, and this can play out in a lot of different ways. I don't know if anybody has some thoughts on this one.
This is the go ahead, Dane.
It's kind of the opposite of the common theistic idea of all glory going to the deity. That seems to be a common idea with theistic philosophies, religions, that all glory is due to the one single deity, and God gets credit for everything. And this is kind of the opposite. The Tao takes no credit for anything.
Yeah, for sure. That would be a little bit of a different worldview.
This is the one that I've had that's kind of struck me the most, and kind of struck a nerve with me when you talked about it, Jim. And because on one hand, just as you just said, we're not solely responsible for everything in our lives ourselves. We don't have the accountability for every single aspect because we are a product of our environment just as much as our decisions. And but I think that humility doesn't go without pride, and vice versa. Like, you do not have just one without the other. You either have both or neither. And I have a problem, I should say, with not having either, because if we don't have pride, which could be a good thing, I guess, we don't have humility, we don't have accountability. And while there are decisions, I think there are decisions on a spectrum of, how much are we responsible for those decisions. There are some that we are a product of, and there are some that we are making on our own volition. And I think that people still need to be held accountable for certain decisions that they are responsible for themselves, versus being able to take pride in things that they have accomplished or the good things that they have, achieved. I think without that, we don't have the incentive to continue to do the good things. So it's the good with the bad, but I think with the absence of the pride and humility and accountability is going to be a worse for us as a society than having both, even though both can be problematic in their own right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we want to.
Yes, I got it. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, again, yin yang kind of comes into play here, where it's not a one or the other. There is definitely a time for having a little bit more confidence and a time for being more humble. But I think the key is here in terms of like accomplishments of recognizing, I think that it's never a solo thing. And that's maybe where more of that humility is coming into play, to recognize the result of all the players in place, not just any one individual.
Yeah, I think with this one, it's important for balance. I mean, you want to feel pride in the work that you do, but you want to have the humility to understand that you're always learning and you don't know everything. And that, you may have accomplished something that you can feel proud of, but that doesn't mean that you should believe that you were the best at that, or that, the circumstances that you're in led you to it on your own. Like, there are always contributing factors, and I think you should always have a hint of each one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. All right. So then the last part that they got into was this idea of this spontaneous following versus demanding obedience. This is an interesting one when we think about modern politics or even business practice, or even just trying to accomplish any particular goals we have. Is, to quote, what's his name, Satra, hell is other people. It can become something where we feel like we need to control everyone because they're just getting in the way. They're making it complicated. If they would just fall in line and follow these rules, then we could accomplish great things as a country, as a business, in my personal life. So working to attract people to a particular way of being, whether you're talking about at the country level or business level or personal level, is a whole different set of skills and challenges and effort. But there's definitely a difference in outcome if people are willingly following because they desire to versus being coerced. I don't know if anybody had some thoughts on that, but we're gonna have to go on this one kind of quick.
I have been thinking about um, my effort to understand the DEI debate that is impacting a lot of the universities, particularly the debate in Harvard. And I'm thinking that if you look at what's going on, we're looking at a lot of inflexibility. We're looking about a lot of pride, and we're looking at a lot of demanding obedience in what the advocates of DEI are reporting. And it's disturbing. It'd be nice if we could get them to follow the attributes of the.
Well, I would extract that even beyond the particular issue. I think politically, we have this across the board. Everything that you're witnessing with the challenge of how DEI is understood or implemented is almost everything right now. Everything is a place of no compromise. Depending on how you answer the question, you're either on our side or the other side. There is no gray. There is no, I mean, this is just a general problem in society right now, that what we see happening in terms of free speech and how we think about the balance of free speech versus, personal safety, what we even think about personal safety and what that means. I mean, there's just so many questions that come into play that definitely are wrestling with all these attributes, right? The flexibility, the acceptance, the humility, the invitation versus the coercion. Yeah, definitely. So there was two other points I wanted to get to here. Might be a little bit difficult based on how much time we have left, but we'll see what happens. So one of the things that we kind of pick up in terms of like the great Tao and this idea of everything being connected and how it impacts everything is more kind of like this ecology mindset. But also it comes into play a lot with what's been developing in terms of this idea of complexity theory. And the basic thing with complexity theory is you can have very large, complex environments or organisms or collections of organisms that behave in a way that looks like it is a coordinated or controlled effort, but in reality is each individual member not actually having knowledge of the whole, but only their local area and how they respond essentially to their neighbor. And the result is something that is quite remarkable in terms of the organization of the thing. But it all boils down to this local control on a very small scale. One of the core examples they frequently bring up with this is like the flock of starlings and how it looks like this very interesting undulating shape that happens like this black cloud, but there's no conductor telling all the birds which way to fly to make all this thing happen. They just have these patterns of how they respond to their nature, to their neighbor, that create this very interesting effect. And so when we think about like ecology, we have a very similar kind of thing going on. One is that all the parts depend on the environment. So if we think about like a forest, we have animals and birds and insects that are all depending on the plants, and the plants are depending on the soil and the water and the sun and the air, and how all those things all work together is a very dependent system, that everything is dependent on the environment. But the flip side is actually also the case that the environment is the collection of all those parts. Right? It's kind of like a both sides of this are kind of contained in one single thing. And because of that, it's somewhat, well, one, it operates in such a way that nobody's actually in control. There isn't a conductor in the forest telling the animals what to do or the plants what to do or how the seasons are supposed to happen. Everything just kind of unfolds and it manages itself, or so it seems. But then it's also, everything is kind of evolved to work within this context. When we get to people, it's a little bit different because now we've actually got some way to think about this where we might come up with ideas to try and do something different that maybe is completely outside of what normally would be happening here. And so the environment is also at risk of if any one of the parts changes. If all of a sudden all the trees are gone, or if the water is polluted, or if the oxygen isn't there, or the sun is blocked out, or a certain type of insect no longer exists. Any one of those things can have just devastating effects on the whole of how that system functions because everything is so integrated. This would be one of the key things then that is in play when they're talking about the great Tao, is that this is one really big interconnected web of everything where the context is actually all the parts, but how all those parts fit together and how they work with each other. So when we think about something like wisdom, and we might say that something like the Daodejing is part of a wisdom tradition, that the goal or the desire or the value that comes out of these different types of traditions is that, are we coming up with goals and desires that are compatible with our environment? And again, it's this idea of how do we work in harmony with it? So when we think about something that's frequently talked about as indigenous wisdom, it's kind of these ways of being with the environment that have been learned over sometimes millennia to be in harmony with the way things work. And really what that ends up being then is a collection of boundaries on behavior of what are we or should we do or not do based off of this larger understanding of how we're integrated with everything else. Maybe I'll just give a moment here to see if you had some thoughts on that.
Honestly, I'm not quite sure how to apply this.
So wisdom would be a collection of practices, let's say, about how to be in the world. And ultimately, they are, how do we be in the world in a way that works with the way the world actually is? This puts boundaries on behavior. So there's things that we are capable of doing, but maybe aren't a good idea to do. That's a very generic high level thing, right?
It's funny, we use that a lot in our workshops and say just because we can doesn't mean we should. I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, we say just because you can walk to California doesn't mean you should. Doesn't count if you're already in California.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's just ways that we see kind of some constraints. And in a certain sense, this is what we're picking up then in the Tao Te Ching through looking at these attributes and trying to emulate, or how do we get in line or in harmony with these patterns that we see as the Tao. Part of this is that we are picking up behaviors that put boundaries on our behavior so that we are not disrupting in a dramatic way the whole interconnected system, right? Now, when we start to fall away from having these kind of natural wisdom ideas, that's where things start to get off track. And maybe one of the ways that we learn, and hopefully not too much of the hard way, what kinds of things should be off the table in terms of behaviors. And this is where there seems to be of late a lot of interest in more indigenous wisdom teachings that might help us to be a little bit more on track, because a lot of people, I think, feel like we're very much off track. So the final thing I want to look at, and this will be a little bit brief given our time remaining, is because Da Dao, the great Tao, brings up this idea that there is this kind of history that's already there into the future, it can have kind of this fatalistic idea of, well, then why do I even do anything? If it's all mapped out, what is the point? So I want to talk a little bit about kind of more of a non-fatalistic way of approaching determinism. So if we think about determinism as the process, right? It's a system of patterns that says, there's cause and effect, and we understand the basic laws of how these things operate. And if we know the state of an environment and we apply the laws of physics, we can know how it's going to unfold to, again, to the degree that we can actually hold the information together. But the fatalistic aspect of it has more to do with the interpretation or the mode of being, that if everything unfolds according to cause and effect, then it can be a way that people can become very fatalistic about the idea. So here's how I would argue that it doesn't need to be looked at that way. One is that the idea of determinism is that everything unfolds according to these regular patterns, that there are these, again, laws of physics that happen that are essential to life. If electrons didn't interact with other electrons or other atoms the way that they do, well, one, we could think about even just at the atom level, but between atoms, falling molecules, all the way, right, from quantum fields up to the stuff that we experience. If those patterns didn't always happen the same way, life itself would not even be possible. Nothing would be possible. Nothing would exist. So we have to recognize the essential aspect of these patterns that actually give rise to the thing that we actually care about. But it's also then essential for learning. If regular patterns did not exist in the world, we wouldn't have any way of learning, because as soon as we thought this is how something worked, it would happen differently and we would never know. So having that ability to learn is going to be important for some basic stuff like survival, but it's also going to give us opportunities to interfere. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. If we see this as how the pattern unfolds and we're wanting to accomplish something a little bit different, once we understand that pattern, we potentially, depending on what kind of pattern we're talking about, have the way to interject into it something different to bring about a different result. So this is how we can actually take action in our world. So we can survive by learning the patterns. We can act in our world by understanding how the patterns happen. And then we can also then think about, how do we develop character? So we have a lot of emphasis on this idea of free will as how we make our decisions. But if everything is cause and effect, then it brings into question, is something like free will even a possibility? And if free will means that we're having some kind of decision that's not based on prior conditions, is that something we would actually want anyway? Don't we want our decisions to be based on what we've learned, what we've experienced, who we are? So I think rather than being concerned about, do I have free will or not, the question needs to be more about, am I capable of learning? And if I am, then the things that I learn, the things that I then subject myself to because I'm trying to learn other things, starts to build the type of character in me that's going to make the kinds of decisions that I want, because the stuff that I learned has now become part of my prior conditions and part of how things unfold. I'm using want in a very careful way here. Our desires are still something that we don't actually have access to. They're still the result of kind of this cause and effect, but they end up in this process of developing learning, depending on what those desires or wants are, that create a different kind of person that then engages in the world in the way that we appear to be engaging in it. So yes, we make choices, but we don't get to choose what we want to choose. But it all kind of works out that way because we exist in such a way that our desires are based off of our experience in our past that bring about those desires for where we're going next, that cause us to learn these things that then unfold in a certain way. So we have all of the pieces that we normally think is what's important in terms of actually choosing the things that we want, even though we don't get to choose what we want. That's kind of a funny way to state that, but there's things that we have desires for. We might not have been able to choose those desires, but we act on them. And the way we act on them is based off of all that prior conditioning and the things that we've learned and acquired. And that's how that process works, where we feel like we have some kind of agency in the world. But the benefit of understanding the patterns gets back to the question that came up earlier with this idea of compassion. How do we understand people and ourselves when we seem to behave in ways that don't make any sense? I know I don't want to eat sugar, but when I see the cookie, I just can't help myself. What's going on there, right? It's not simply just willpower. There's all kinds of things that we wrestle with. And this is having the correct diagnosis of the situation is the first step to actually being able to make progress. And if we are not understanding the situation correctly by thinking it's just simply a matter of willpower, then we're not going to make a lot of progress in the whole thing. So yeah, the learning becomes part of the prior state, and that's kind of the key. So I know it's a little bit rushed. We're kind of right up at the wire there, but any last thoughts on this episode? Does this help with thinking about that idea of determinism as it not being fatalistic? Yes, no? A little bit?
I'm not sure yet.
As you were going through this, I was thinking about cancer research and the fact that the ability to analyze and look at patterns gives us maybe some opportunities to interfere with a disease. And I know that that's not exactly where this was heading, but it's actually a very positive note from that standpoint.
Yeah, it all kind of fits in that same direction. Well, I think we'll have to bring this to a close for now, but we will come back to this idea of how does that determinism play into things. Oh, hey, Chaz, I didn't realize you came on board. But yeah, we'll just kind of have to leave it there for now. And I just want to say that if you've been watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion, you can register your email at kinship.cafe, and you'll get links to the Zoom that we hold on Friday mornings, as well as an invitation if you happen to be in the Southern California area to our live presentations on Sunday morning. With that, I just want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.